Ah, the countryside. I must say, after 4 long years of Betafied, it's nice to take a vacation every once in a while. I just hope that nothing wacky and uncharacteristic happens while I'm here on the Owl Express.
Oh, did you say Owl Express there, lad? No, this here ain't the Owl Express. This here's the Science Express.
The what? Before we had Battle of the Birds, A Hat in Time's second chapter, we had The Science Express, A Hat in Time's third chapter. This chapter began its development in August of 2013, and if you've ever had the opportunity to play the alpha, or, in the very least, have seen footage of it, such as my streams, you'll probably be more than a bit familiar with the unique owls from this time period. See, by the very conception of the chapter, there were 2 things concluded about it. First, it would have birds in it, and second, it would have a train. There is much to be said about the Science Express, and the many things that we never saw in the final game for this chapter. However, on today's episode of Betafied, I'd like to hone in on a particular subject that not everyone knows much about. This certain individual is shrouded in a bit of mystery in how they had behaved and where they came from. With that, allow me to do my introduction. Hello everyone, my name is Wolfblock, and welcome to Betafied, the show where we take a look at the unused and cut content of a game and try to figure out what it was, how it worked, and why it was removed from the final version. Join me today as we take a look at one of the last major cut characters of the game, the Shapeshifter. To understand the Shapeshifter, we first need to look at where they came from. The Science Express was initially a much more linear chapter than what we have in the final game, and it was saturated with many more characters and unique enemies than what we see nowadays. To begin, let's talk about the Conductor. And when I say the Conductor, I mean conductors. See, there was initially going to be 3 different conductors, all with separate colored suits to differentiate them from each other, and names to match their colors, much like the Man family from Team Fortress. We had Red, Walter, and Greg. Red's color should be pretty obvious. Walter was white, and Greg was green. In addition to the 3 Conductor brothers, we had a multitude of cut enemies in the form of the Science Owls. Although similar to their Express Owl equivalents from the final game, these enemies were undoubtedly unique. Unlike the Express Owl enemies in the final game, the Science Owls were able to throw many more things than just clipboards. Science Owls could throw blue potions that would deal 2 damage to the player, purple shrink potions that would turn the player tiny and activate the owl's rapid fire attack, and yellow potions that would force the player into a running state for a period of time. In addition to this, there were 3 extra variants to the enemy, including the Fire Science Owl, who would always throw 5 yellow potions in rapid succession to each other before running away, the Charge Science Owl, who would rev up a charge attack before running at the player, and the Laser Science Owl, who was actually used in the beta version of Train Rush, where he fired a giant laser at the player. Now, the main takeaway of this section is to explain that this chapter was once much more focused and based around a linear level progression than its final equivalent. The inhabitants of the Science Express were both much more numerous and much more apathetic to Hat Kid as a character, with the Science Owls seeing her as a dumb pest, as seen on their clipboards, and the 3 conductors being much more preoccupied with running their train rather than focusing on her. All in all, there were a lot of varied and different individuals on the train, which would make it the perfect opportunity to stage a murder. The murder mystery movie we all know and love from the final game today was not always so lighthearted and happy. As a matter of fact, the knife wasn't always rubber. That's right, when first developed, the murder on the Science Express was going to include an actual murder, with elements of actual murder mystery incorporated in it. Unlike the simpler, collect the evidence linear story that we have in the final, Murder on the Science Express appears to have been planned with more things in mind. From localization files from the beta, as well as these unused icons, we can discern that this act would have initially included more detective work than what's seen in the final, with Hat Kid even having her own magnifying glass, an object that was advertised with early screenshots, but only found unused in the hub in the final game. The localization for Red also showcases what would be done with the evidence. Implied through these lines, Hat Kid would use evidence discovered throughout the train with suspects in order to collect alibis. For example, showing the "Red was here" graffiti to Red, or, as the names of the lines in the character's trouble to remember their own name implies, someone possibly disguised as Red, maybe Greg or someone else, would lead to unique dialogue that likely could be used as evidence in deciding who the murderer was. As seen from this concept art, one of the concepts brought forth for this level was that Hat Kid would have to catch the murderer themselves using traps. Now, you may notice that the Ka agent is no longer a Ka agent as they leave the net. As a matter of fact, taking a look at these character icons for the act, you can't really point out any one character that would be the murderer. They're different from the final, but they're still just random generic characters. And that, of course, is where the character for today's episode gets their name from. So, who exactly was the Shapeshifter? Well, this interesting individual right here was, of course. But there is more to this question. What was this character's species? Their motivation? Their behavior? Well, let's tackle these things one at a time, shall we? The Shapeshifter, as their name implies, was an amorphous shape-shifting blob creature, capable of disguising themselves as others. The name on its own is evidence enough to this, as is the evidence taken in the form of developers flat out stating that this is how it works. Our concept art here also confirms this, which leads to my second part about the Shapeshifter. This dude was a jerk. The kind that kills people for seemingly no reason, and doesn't really take the situation very seriously. The second claim here is evidenced by their only known dialogue.
"Oh my god! I'm totally busted! How embarrassing! Wanna hear a story? When I was in kindergarten, I knew a girl who looked just like you, and whenever I would talk to her, she would yell, 'The murderer's in here!'"
So, we know where the Shapeshifter would be, we know what the Shapeshifter could do, and we know how the Shapeshifter would act, but there's still a major point here that requires explanation. Who exactly was the Shapeshifter? The answer may surprise you. Here is the big claim for today's episode. The Shapeshifter was the other half of Hat Kid herself. Now, this claim may seem crazy if you're new to the series, but I assure you, there is ample evidence to back up this claim. To explain what I mean when I say that Shapeshifter came from Hat Kid, we need to first take a step back and look at some information I provided in episode 6. In this episode, I explained the concept of a cut group of characters known as shadows. To summarize what was explained in that video, a shadow is a piece of a character that has broken off and gained its own consciousness. For a shadow to be created, there were 3 conditions that must be met. First, the shadow must come from a time traveler. Second, the time traveler must be in a place where they don't belong. And third, the timeline the time traveler is in must have been damaged in one way or another. Up to the point of that episode's release, we were aware of 2 shadow characters, Tim's friend and the Snatcher. However, I'm here to say that, fitting with those 3 rules, Hat Kid also had a shadow, and that shadow was the Shapeshifter. Now, when I released episode 6, I received quite a bit of pushback from some members of the cut content community regarding the claim that the Snatcher was a shadow, especially since there have been conflicting reports about the character's origin, with sources also stating that he was the prince's shadow, forming after the ritual that turned the prince into the Moonjumper. A big part of this pushback comes from the difference between the actual lore that was tried during the game's development and the extended lore that has been created by artist and prior developer Shane Frost as part of his Hat in Time comic. The biggest issue here that I know is going to come up is that this claim was made specifically in Shane's comic. I know exactly what you folks are thinking right about now. Wolfclock, you expect us to believe that this idea was actually something that was planned for the game, and not just a convenient piece together after the fact with Shane's comic? Seems like science fiction if you ask me. Trust me, I understand exactly where this mentality is coming from. The concept of shadows was seldom explained even to developers during the process of the game being created. However, with that being said, I want to point to a number of things regarding the Shapeshifter that lines up with this idea that she was originally intended to be a shadow character. Let's start off by remembering that, even if the shadow concept didn't stick incredibly well in the writing room, it was definitely something conceptualized during the game's development. This is evidenced by the existence of Tim's friend. For those who haven't seen Betafied episodes 4 and 6, Tim's friend was the shadow of Tim, the CEO of Time, who was referred to as Tim's imaginary friend, and was meant as a sort of second half to Tim, being the more collected and rational of the two. Tim's friend spoke in a calm yet collected manner and would have been the character responsible for giving Hat Kid her umbrella at the start of the game, as well as explaining to her how to fight. In essence, Tim's friend contained the characteristics that Tim himself seemed to lack, or at least didn't showcase publicly. Next off, we have the Snatcher, a carefree, wacky wildcard kleptomaniac with a non-serious attitude. Whether we look at him as the shadow of the prince, or the shadow of the unknown alien, we can see opposite characteristics. In the case of the prince, he's much more loose than one would expect a royal to be, and in the case of the alien, well, in the comic lore, they left him behind in the Subcon Forest by leaving a mask with them. Obviously, the opposite of abandonment would be to steal and collect things for yourself. All in all, the point I'm trying to make is that, even if the idea of shadow characters wasn't something understood by all of the developers, it was, in the very least, a concept that subconsciously crept into multiple characters. Now, onto why the Shapeshifter is a shadow, for reasons other than because the comic said so. To summarize my point from the previous section, the characteristics that shadow characters possess seem to be amplifications of the characteristics that their origins tried to repress. Tim's friend is as serious as Tim is silly, the Snatcher holds on to things in response to being let go, and the Shapeshifter seems to be as evil as Hat Kid is supposed to be nice. When we look at things in these terms, it starts to add up that Shapeshifter is Hat Kid's shadow. However, we're not quite done just yet. Looking at the Shapeshifter's design, we can see a clear relation to Tim's friend and the Snatcher as well. They're strange, somewhat squishy, somewhat drippy, not quite set in stone designs. Almost as if they're dreams trying to manifest in reality, or blurry shadows trying to sharpen themselves. I mean, just look at her design. She's patched together from various miscellaneous and indescribable pieces of varying colors. No single piece seems to fit with another. Like Tim's friend, we can see parts of her seemingly drooping off as if they're dripping right off of her. The drippiness is more explicit in the comic, but going off of official concept art and the character model alone, that design point is still very clearly there. Also similarity with Tim's friend are the eyes. Both of these two characters include strange eyes that don't seem to be practical, all working or in places where they belong. In Tim's friend's case, they have an eye right in the middle of their stomach, which we've seen dart around before. In the case of the Shapeshifter, the eyes are all over the place, not quite certain about what they're supposed to look like or what they're supposed to be looking at. So, in summary, the Shapeshifter's personality, characteristics, and design are all reminiscent to that of Tim's friends and the Snatchers, with her personality mirroring the more sinister side of Hat Kid. All in all, these factors have all but confirmed to me that the Shapeshifter was designed to be Hat Kid's shadow. So, we now know that the Shapeshifter was the true murderer to the murder on the Science Express. We know that she would disguise herself as one of the passengers and attempt to go on a killing spree within the train while Hat Kid would try to stop her. We also know that, in terms of the game's story, she was the resulting shadow of Hat Kid visiting the broken timeline of the Science Express. Now that we know these things, it's time to ask the question: why was the Shapeshifter removed? Like many other things during the game's development, the third chapter of the game had to be truncated greatly. With this, several acts were removed, and ones that weren't were trimmed down. Many additional characters had to either be removed or merged into singular ones. Murder of the Science Express is one of the perfect examples of this trimming. The level we got in the final game was significantly simpler and more linear than what was initially intended. Even finding the murderer was reduced to making any choice you want, without there being a single correct answer. With all these changes, Shapeshifter, along with the different conductors, all found themselves on the cutting room floor. It's always sad to see such wild and radical designs like this go unused. even after their creation and implementation into the game itself. But, as game development goes, not everything gets to see the light of day. And although the Shapeshifter would have been radically important to Hat Kid's personal storyline, she'll have to settle for less in her final resting place inside of Queen Vanessa's manor. Thank you all very much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, feel free to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new uploads. As you can see, the majority of viewers that watch these videos are not subscribed, but you can do your part to fix that. Don't worry, I don't upload all that often, so I won't flood your inbox. If you're interested in more Betafied videos on A Hat in Time, I have an official playlist for them right here. And if you're interested in this series as a whole, I have a mega playlist for all my Betafieds here. If you want to see me cover a specific topic in the future, feel free to comment it below. I've been Wolfclock, and I will see you all in the next video, whenever it may be. Thanks for watching.